Near Sainte-Mère-Église, Normandy, Obergefreiter Klaus Müller of the 709th Infantry Division stared in disbelief at the column of American vehicles streaming inland from Utah Beach. Within a brief span, he had counted over 100 identical military reconnaissance cars, each appearing as fresh as if it had just rolled off a factory floor. What Müller witnessed that morning was not merely an invasion, but an industrial phenomenon that would shatter every assumption the Wehrmacht had made about warfare. These vehicles, which the Americans called jeeps, had crossed the Atlantic Ocean by the thousands, and their sheer numbers revealed a truth more devastating than any artillery barrage. Germany was not fighting an army, but an entire industrial system that had transformed warfare into mass production. The jeeps had begun arriving with the first wave of landings, driven directly off landing ship tanks that had crossed the English Channel in endless convoys. Each LST could carry up to 30 fully assembled jeeps, and hundreds of these ships were delivering their cargo to the Norman coast. The vehicles bore the markings of either Willys Overland Motor Company of Toledo, Ohio, or Ford Motor Company of Dearborn, Michigan. Their official designation read, Truck 1/4 ton 4x4 Command Reconnaissance. But to the German soldiers watching them pour onto French soil, they represented something far more ominous, evidence of an industrial capacity that defied comprehension. Hauptmann Werner Lindemann, commanding the 3rd Company of the 919th Grenadier Regiment, recorded in his after-action report that the enemy possessed vehicles in quantities they reserved for ammunition rounds. Every American unit down to the squad level appeared to have motorized transport. They destroyed a dozen of these reconnaissance cars one day, yet counted 40 in the same sector the next morning. The Americans treated complex military vehicles the way the Germans treated rifle cartridges, as items to be used and discarded without thought. The statistics of American Jeep production would have stunned German military planners had they known them. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories produced over 640,000 Jeeps. At peak production, Willys Overland and Ford were completing one vehicle every 90 seconds on their assembly lines. This single vehicle type represented 1/4 of all American military motor transport production. The Germans, who had managed to produce barely 50,000 Kübelwagens during the entire war, could not conceive of such numbers. What made this production miracle possible was a standardization that exceeded anything in German military experience. Every Jeep, whether built by Willys or Ford, used completely interchangeable parts. A transmission from a destroyed Ford GPW could be installed in a Willys MB in minutes. Wheels, engines, axles, and even minor components like spark plugs and fan belts were identical across all production runs. This standardization extended to the supply system, where spare parts were pre-positioned based on statistical analysis of failure rates, ensuring that replacement components were always available. Feldwebel Hans Richter of the 716th Static Infantry Division, observing American operations from a concealed position near Carentan, wrote in his diary that the Americans didn't repair their vehicles, they simply replaced broken parts with new ones from an endless supply. He watched a damaged vehicle restored to operation in less than an hour. The engine wasn't repaired, but replaced entirely, unbolted and lifted out, with a fresh engine installed as casually as changing a tire. German mechanics would require a week to perform such an operation. The Americans did it in a field under sporadic artillery fire while smoking cigarettes. The German military mind, trained in the tradition of preserving and maintaining every piece of equipment, struggled to comprehend the American approach. In the Wehrmacht, a vehicle was assigned to a unit and carefully tracked throughout its service life. Losing a vehicle through negligence was a court-martial offense. Mechanical problems were diagnosed with precision. Parts were carefully repaired or manufactured when replacements were unavailable. The Kübelwagen, Germany's equivalent to the Jeep, required factory-trained mechanics for any significant maintenance.
The Americans operated on entirely different principles. They had calculated that a Jeep's combat life expectancy was 90 days and planned accordingly. Rather than investing in elaborate repair facilities, they simply manufactured replacements in quantities that exceeded any possible loss rate. When a Jeep was damaged beyond immediate repair, it was stripped of usable parts and abandoned. A new vehicle would arrive within hours or days, delivered by the endless convoys that connected the beaches to the advancing front lines. Lieutenant Colonel Otto von Schroeder, Chief of Staff of the 352nd Infantry Division, captured the German bewilderment in a letter to his wife. The Americans fought a rich man's war, expending vehicles the way the Germans expended ammunition. He observed a Jeep strike a mine. The crew emerged unharmed, transferred their equipment to another vehicle that appeared within minutes, and continued their mission. The destroyed Jeep was pushed to the roadside and forgotten. In the German army, such a loss would require reports, investigations, and weeks of effort to obtain a replacement. Within days, American forces had landed over 12,000 vehicles in Normandy, with Jeeps comprising the largest single category. These vehicles transformed the battlefield in ways German doctrine had not anticipated. American reconnaissance units penetrated German lines with unprecedented speed and flexibility. Artillery forward observers in Jeeps could rapidly relocate, making counter-battery fire nearly impossible. Supply units maintained continuous contact with advancing forces, eliminating the pauses for consolidation that German commanders had expected to exploit. The Jeep's capabilities compounded German difficulties. With its four-wheel drive and low weight, it could traverse terrain that German planners had considered impossible for vehicles. The Norman bocage country, with its sunken roads and thick hedges, should have channeled American vehicles into kill zones. Instead, Jeeps simply drove through fields, over embankments, and around obstacles. They created their own road network independent of the mapped routes German forces had prepared to defend. Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding a battle group of the 21st Panzer Division, wrote after the war that the Jeep gave every American unit the mobility the Germans had achieved only with their elite mechanized forces. A single vehicle could carry a machine gun team, a mortar crew, communications equipment, or supplies. They appeared everywhere, in places the Germans thought secure, bringing firepower or calling in artillery with their radios. The Germans could not establish a continuous front because the Americans simply drove around their positions. The maintenance and supply systems supporting these vehicles proved equally overwhelming. American logistics units had prepared for operations on an industrial scale. Ships arrived daily carrying not just fuel and ammunition, but entire vehicles, spare engines, transmissions, and pre-packaged component sets. Mobile workshops advanced immediately behind combat units, capable of performing any repair or replacement. If a unit lost 10 Jeeps in combat, 10 replacements would arrive within 48 hours, often less. Major Heinrich Zimmermann, of the 12th SS Panzer Division, observed that the American supply system operated like a factory production line extended to the battlefield. Everything was standardized, packaged, and delivered on schedule. They had removed the friction from warfare that Clausewitz described. While the Germans struggled to maintain their existing equipment, the Americans simply ordered replacements as if from a catalog. The psychological impact on German forces became evident within days of the invasion. Soldiers who'd been told that Americans were soft and dependent on material comfort discovered an enemy who possessed material abundance beyond imagination. The sight of endless columns of identical Jeeps, each one new and fully equipped, demoralized troops who were carefully preserving vehicles that had been in service since the Polish campaign. Gefreiter Wolfgang Braun, A mechanic with the 21st Panzer Division examined captured Jeeps and reported that every component was designed for mass production and easy replacement. The engine was simple but adequate. The transmission was robust rather than refined. Nothing was polished or precisely fitted, yet everything functioned reliably. They had sacrificed elegance for quantity, and quantity was winning the war. The racial integration visible in American motor pools particularly troubled German observers indoctrinated in Nazi ideology. African American soldiers drove Jeeps, maintained them, and supervised motor pools. This challenged fundamental Nazi assumptions about racial hierarchy and military effectiveness. Feldwebel Kurt Wagner noted with bewilderment that Negro soldiers operated and repaired these vehicles with the same efficiency as white soldiers. Their racial theories suggested this should be impossible, yet the evidence was undeniable. American modifications to their Jeeps demonstrated a flexibility that German military culture could not accommodate. Within days of landing, units were welding additional armor plate, installing wire cutters to counter German piano wire traps, mounting multiple machine guns, and adapting vehicles for specialized roles. Medical units converted Jeeps to ambulances by installing stretcher racks. Signal units loaded them with radio equipment. Engineers mounted mine detectors. Each modification was crude by German standards, but immediately effective.
The contrast with German equipment became increasingly stark as the campaign progressed. The Wehrmacht's vehicles required specific fuel grades, specialized spare parts, and trained mechanics. Many German units still relied on horse-drawn transport, with a single division requiring thousands of horses that consumed tons of fodder daily. The horses were vulnerable to artillery, required constant care, and limited mobility to walking pace. Watching American units advance at 30 miles per hour in vehicles that required only gasoline and basic maintenance was deeply demoralizing. Within days, intelligence estimated that American forces in Normandy possessed over 4,000 Jeeps, with hundreds more arriving daily. This number seemed impossible to officers who remembered the entire German army invading Poland with fewer than 3,000 motor vehicles of all types. The mathematics of American production suggested that the United States could lose every vehicle in Normandy and replace them all within 2 weeks. Colonel Ernst Wagner of a Panzer Division compiled a report that reached Field Marshal Rommel shortly before his injury. They faced an enemy who had industrialized warfare to a degree they never imagined possible. The Americans mass-produced military vehicles with the same methods they produced civilian automobiles. Every American soldier seemed to know how to drive and perform basic maintenance. Their entire society was mobilized for mechanical warfare in a way Germany never achieved. The disparity in production philosophy proved unbridgeable. German vehicles like the Kübelwagen were well-engineered, carefully constructed, and designed for longevity. But Germany could produce only a few dozen per day at peak output. American Jeeps were simple, crude by German standards, but rolled off assembly lines at rates Germany could not match with all its factories combined. Where German industries sought perfection, American industries sought adequacy, multiplied by overwhelming numbers. General Major Fritz Bayerlein, commander of a Panzer Division, provided a stark assessment. They were fighting the last war, while the Americans fought the next one. The Germans perfected individual vehicles, while the Americans perfected the system that produced vehicles. They trained specialist mechanics, while the Americans designed vehicles any soldier could maintain. They were artisans fighting an assembly line, and the assembly line was winning. The American system's redundancy frustrated German tactical planning. Destroying a bridge to halt American supply columns proved futile when engineers appeared with portable bridging equipment carried on Jeeps. Ambushing reconnaissance patrols achieved little when identical replacement vehicles and crews appeared within hours. Mining roads only caused Americans to drive through fields. Every German tactical success was negated by American material abundance. The Jeep became a symbol of this abundance that transcended its military function.
German soldiers reported seeing jeeps used for tasks that would have been unthinkable in the Wehrmacht, delivering mail, transporting journalists, carrying chaplains to forward positions, even moving generals' personal baggage. This casual use of military equipment for convenience, rather than necessity, demonstrated a wealth that German soldiers, accustomed to scarcity and careful preservation, found both amazing and demoralizing. Lieutenant Friedrich Hoffmann wrote to his family that the Americans used their vehicles like the Germans used bicycles, for everything and without concern for wear. He saw a jeep being used to deliver hot food to a single outpost, a trip that wore the engine and consumed fuel for the comfort of 3 men. In the German army, those men would walk and eat cold rations. This wastefulness should be a weakness, but when you can waste without consequence, it becomes a form of strength. The technological gap appeared in unexpected ways. American jeeps came equipped with standardized toolkits, comprehensive maintenance manuals printed on waterproof paper, and spare parts packages calculated by statistical analysis. German vehicles often lacked basic tools, relied on mechanics' experience rather than documentation, and competed for scarce spare parts through a complex requisition system that could take weeks. As the campaign progressed, German forces found themselves increasingly unable to compete with American mobility. Static defensive positions were outflanked by jeep-mounted reconnaissance units. Artillery positions were overrun by rapidly advancing motorized infantry. Supply lines were cut by fast-moving patrols that appeared behind German lines, struck, and disappeared before reserves could respond. The battlefield had become fluid in ways that favored the side with unlimited motorized transport. Major Wilhelm von Thoma, observing the American breakout preparations, wrote that they had achieved something the Germans thought impossible: the complete motorization of an army. Every soldier could be moved by vehicle. Every gun could be towed at highway speeds. Every supply item could be delivered directly to the consumer. They were fighting a 19th century war against a 20th century enemy. The German High Command's attempts to counter American motorization proved futile. Orders to target vehicle concentrations were meaningless when vehicles were everywhere. Efforts to interdict supply lines failed when every unit possessed organic transportation. Plans to exploit American dependence on fuel were negated by a supply system that delivered gasoline in quantities Germany hadn't seen in years. By the time of Operation Cobra, American forces in Normandy possessed over 15,000 vehicles, with jeeps being the single largest category. German estimates compiled from prisoner interrogations and aerial reconnaissance suggested the Americans could suffer 50% vehicle losses and remain more motorized than any German division at full strength. This calculation, when reported to Berlin, was dismissed as defeatist. It was actually conservative. The influence of American motorization extended beyond immediate military impact. German officers who survived the war would carry these lessons into the reconstruction of post-war Germany. The American model of standardization, mass production, and design simplicity would influence German industrial development. The Volkswagen, which had failed as the Kübelwagen to compete with the Jeep in war, would succeed as the Beetle in peace, applying mass production principles the Americans had demonstrated so devastatingly. Feldwebel Otto Schultz, who spent 3 years as a prisoner of war in America, later reflected that in Normandy, they learned that modern war was not about courage or skill, but about industrial capacity. The Americans showed them that victory belonged to whoever could produce the most, ship the fastest, and replace losses immediately. The Jeep was not just a vehicle, but a symbol of a new kind of warfare they were not prepared to fight. The story of German troops encountering American mass motorization in Normandy represents more than a military mismatch. It was a collision between 2 different civilizations' approaches to warfare. The Germans, with their tradition of professional military excellence and carefully maintained equipment, met an American military that had transformed warfare into an exercise in industrial management and mass production. In the end, the endless columns of jeeps that poured across Normandy represented something more profound than military vehicles. They were the physical manifestation of the arsenal of democracy, proof that American industrial might could be projected across oceans and delivered to battlefields in quantities that rendered traditional military calculations obsolete. For German soldiers watching those columns advance, each jeep was a messenger bearing the same simple truth. The age of artisan warfare had ended, and the age of industrial warfare had begun. The last word belongs to Hauptmann Ernst Bergmann, who observed American operations throughout the Normandy campaign and survived to become an automotive engineer in post-war Germany. The Americans taught them that in modern war, the factory is more important than the battlefield. Their jeeps, arriving in endless numbers, each one identical and replaceable, showed them that warfare had become a branch of industry. They thought they were soldiers. The Americans showed them they were simply workers in a factory of destruction, and the American factory was infinitely larger and more efficient than theirs.